to do today was just lay the foundation as we talk about communications, talk about communication plans. What do we think about when we think about the components of a communication plan? Why do we focus on communication planning and think about communication planning as a driver for some of this work in order to disseminate and get our messages and work out into the field? I think many of you are probably aware of this ongoing challenge that we often have in education and in every field, right? We do good research or develop great products, or we do all of this work. How do we get people to know about the work that we're doing? How do we get that message to the right audiences? How do we make practice change based on this work? Well, if we don't have ways to really think about our communication and think strategically about our communication, it's often really hard for us to break that barrier. And so we might spend a lot of time, make something really wonderful, and then it doesn't get seen by as many people or internalized and implemented by as many people as we would hope. So we really wanted to just lay the foundation today about some of the components that we think about in communication planning. So as we think about why we focus on a communication plan, we really want to create a plan and a living document to create communication and dissemination for everyone's responsibility. I think probably folks have also had that experience where communications is targeted and given to a small task force or a small group. But if we're not all communicating a similar message, we don't have a clear understanding of what our message is, how we're reaching people, we're going to all have a little bit different terminology and messages and things that go out to the field. And it creates coherence challenges, it creates internalization challenges, so many different factors. So we really want to create a document that can be a grounding for everyone that is doing this work so that we can see communication and dissemination as everyone's responsibility as we move to do this work in the field. It also helps us to really think, again, strategically, intentionally, really focus our efforts so that we can really get the most bang for our buck. And really thinking about how do we prioritize, who are the right people that we need to touch, what are the right messages that we really need to focus on. Sometimes we try and do too much for everything and we don't go deep enough on anything. I've had that experience before. And so really helping us to think about the lay of the land, but also really being strategic about where are we going to focus and target our efforts. And then we also want to think about how we can connect to our audience, both our internal audiences and making sure we have a similar message and we're all on the same page, as well as externally connecting with the people in the field, the stakeholders that are going to move the needle for us across the levels of our system. And so thinking about what their priorities are, what their goals are, and so on. So we want to create a communication plan that's both flexible and provides us with some structure and thoughts about how we move forward. And so the communication plan provides us with a foundation, but it's not something that's prescriptive or a one-size-fits-all model or one route that we need to take. It just creates the coherence for us as a team to really move this work forward. So as we think about components of a communication plan, some of the areas that we want to think about are up here on the slide. You can see that our communication plan, we really wanted to start with some kind of a targeted focus for our work. We can communicate about a lot of different things, so we need to outline what is our overarching goal for this work that we want to move forward. And then what are the key objectives that will get us there? What are some of the areas that we need to target in order to meet our goal? And the strategies and tactics that we can then use that are aligned with our objectives and are aligned with our goals to get the message out there. And throughout each level of that triangle, we really want to think about the audiences that we're intending to reach, as well as how we know whether we'll be successful with what we're doing. We always want to think, like in any kind of planning, what is our ongoing objective and how do we know if we're going to get there? And what are some of the outcome measures that we'll look at in order to monitor along the way formatively whether or not we're making the goals that we're hoping for with our plan? Starting with the key audience and identifying who our audiences are. We want to focus on that as our foundation because we might have different strategies and tactics that we use for different audiences. We'll create different messages for our different audiences. So we want to first focus on really outlining who we want to communicate to and being specific about who those audience members are, who should care about that message that we're trying to deliver or what our overarching communication goal is and why they care about that information. That will be really helpful for us as we think about moving this work forward. And these are just some questions that we want to think about as we think about meeting the needs of our audiences. We want to think about what our audiences do that they're already doing that we want them to continue to do, really thinking about what do we want them to do, what can we leverage that they might be doing right now, and what can we ask them to do that might be a little bit different, any actions we want them to take, and thinking about the different segments of our audiences. As I mentioned before, we want to target different messages or different tactics and strategies to those different audience members, and so we want to think about that. We want to think think about their values, needs, beliefs, and priorities? Do we have a champion in a specific area that can help us share that message out with a larger audience? Thinking about the sources of information they trust and all of that. So we really unpack a lot of questions about our audience. Next, we also want to think about, as I mentioned before, the goals and objectives. Why communicate and what do we want to achieve with our communication, right? This will help us drive that last feature that we want to think about measuring our impact if we have clear goals and objectives along the way with our communication plan. Oftentimes, we just say we're going to communicate for the sake of communicating or because we just want to do global outreach or some other kind of metric. We really want to be specific when we think about our goals and objectives and help us move forward. Areas that we might focus on might be our focus on raising awareness about some kind of a knowledge, about a new plan, a new strategy, something like that. Or are we focused on action, really having people make a change in their approach in what they're doing and so on. And then we also might think about understanding and really thinking about kind of building knowledge and skills. So different goals within our communications will have different strategies and different audiences that we might be targeting and different tactics we might be using based on what is our overarching goal. And oftentimes we might have a multi-pronged strategy, right? We might first want to raise awareness about something and then really think about what do we need to do to unpack and get to action and understanding and so on. So it's not to say that you only have one of these, but really thinking about, as we're thinking about our initial goals, what are they and then how can we make sure that we meet those goals? The next piece that we really want to think about is our messages. So what do we want to communicate? We talk about why we're communicating, who we want to communicate to. Then we need to really think about what the message is that we want to communicate and what people need to know. We want to be thoughtful about being clear and concise and being able to repeat that information, make it digestible and understandable, and think about those audiences when we're creating our messages. We know that what we're going to communicate to someone who is research background is going to be very different from what we communicate to someone that doesn't have that deep knowledge and might need a message in a slightly different way. But we want to be thoughtful about how we communicate and what our messages are so we can make sure that we get a hook that people are really interested in. After we have our key messages that we want to think about how we're going to deliver that to who and when, what is our communication strategies, and what tactics are we going to use to get that. So this is really where we think about the blueprint of our communication plan and really thinking about the strategies to get us to the goal that we have identified and we want to meet. So creating an outline that shows how our tactics link to our key audiences and link back to the goal and objectives that we have put in place really help us to think through what we're doing. We think about a range of tactics and strategies that we can use, and sometimes we have to prioritize those based on what we have resources to do. So this is a good place for us to brainstorm a lot of different strategies and tactics and then narrow down to some that are more manageable for us to actually accomplish or to build on over time. The last and probably one of the most often overlooked areas that we want to incorporate into our plans are our measures for evaluation. Again, thinking about how we know we'll be successful and thinking about what metrics we might use. So we might think about if we have a website, increasing the traffic to our website. We might look at whether people are downloading the resource that we have put out or viewing a video or a webinar or some of that. We might look at some of the analytics there that can help us understand whether we're reaching people and people are consuming it. We might look at how long people are on our website and some other factors there. We also might think about things around other strategies and tactics, increasing conferences or training participation, thinking about the number of courses embedded, the high leverage practices based on our focus and message and so on. So we want to think about, as we're looking at our goals and objectives early on, how will we know whether we get there and what are some of the methods that we're going to use along the way in order to do that. And then we'll think about all of the different ways that we can capture that information, whether or not it's analytics information, whether it's information about training participation, whether it's change in practice and so on. We want to think about what are those strategies for collecting that information. And then also thinking about not just saying, okay, we completed this activity or we did X, Y, and Z, but really what was the impact of that activity? And so thinking about some of those outcome metrics is a really important feature in our measures of evaluation versus just focusing on did we accomplish what we said we were or did we put this piece into place? Because that's often easier for us to measure. And so it might be our first tactic, but we want to think about not just the success of doing that, but did we actually see growth in visitors to the site or did we have a larger reach or get new visitors to come in or so on. So we want to think a little bit wider about our metrics. We wanted to start with just a basic frame for the areas that we're talking about, the audience, the objectives, the key messages, the tactics, and the measures for evaluation, and then the overarching goals for our communication, so that we can outline each of those steps as we go along the way. This is just a sample planning tool. It is very basic, but it will help us to ground our conversations around that audience piece, around identifying objectives and messages. And it's purposeful that there are multiple levels under each of those audience types, because we know that oftentimes we'll have multiple objectives to reach a specific audience, or we'll have multiple messages. And so we really want to think about how those all layer together. And it's likely to get much more complex as we get into the weeds of things, but really starting with the simplicity was the goal here, just to outline what we want to think about in each step of the way.